Hi, my name is Ophi YouTube Videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. And this video definitely fits that bill because this is a feminist discourse video, but it's a very specific kind of feminist discourse video. I want to set a few things about the tone before we get much further in, because I will be talking about the larger phenomena behind and the existing history of some things that are very much like something that seems to be sort of being imported to and appropriated by American feminist women from a radical feminist movement in South Korea. We're going to be talking only actually a little bit about the 4B movement in this video, but I still want to give you a definition. 4B loses its alliteration once it's translated, but pulling from Wikipedia here, 4B was originally defined as, quote, the motto of radical feminism, which means non-marriage, non-procreation, non-relationship, and non-sex. And the posts that I personally have seen circulating around 4B pretty much begin and end on those 4Bs. We'll get to it. I for sure have feelings about it. The posts are mostly about that, and also maybe a bit about finding ways to feel superior to women who are not engaging in this 4B branch of feminism. So I want to be clear that what I'm doing in this video isn't exactly examining and deciding for you whether or not I think you should break up with your boyfriend. This video is not me debating the morality or the ethics of having a boyfriend. It is not a referendum on whether or not women who have Republican boyfriends even should be included in my feminism. They are. And what I want to do in this video instead, rather than just debating whether or not women should have boyfriends, is something a little bit more like a history lesson. I want to get into the ways that this 4B movement is not a new idea, and how we already know from past experience that movements like this are detrimental to solidarity and to progress. While the name 4B and some of the phrasing for this current iteration is coming to us from South Korea, where I really don't feel qualified to speak to all of the ways that the culture is different for women than it is here in the United States where I live. I believe, though, that part of what makes the 4B idea so appealing is that it is not a fully unfamiliar concept. This is something feminists, specifically radical feminists, actually, have already tried here in the United States as well, if, just not very successfully. I also don't actually know whether or not it's the case that it's only in the United States where there has been a resurgence of this separatist debate. I just know that I personally started seeing it immediately following the 2024 election, and that definitely influenced the shape that this video took. However, in terms of things very much like this 4B movement that have already been attempted, let me talk about something I do feel much more qualified to speak to than the gender dynamics in South Korea. Alyssa Milano's call for a sex strike in 2019. Alyssa Milano is an American actress and an outspoken feminist. And following the kind of first rash of extreme abortion bans that were lined up in 2019 before we even got the Supreme Court decision that lost us Roe versus Wade, Alyssa called on Twitter for a sex strike. She wrote, "Our reproductive rights are being erased. Until women have legal control over our own bodies, we just cannot risk pregnancy. Join me by not having sex until we get bodily autonomy back. I'm calling for a hashtag sex strike. Pass it on." And I do want to provide a tiny bit of nuance for Alyssa Milano, actually. Though I do think, of course, that sometimes when people clown on this sex strike thing, it is kind of earned. We'll get into what the criticisms of this sex strike proposal were at the moment and how they tie into the larger picture here with separatism, but I do want to just kind of note that this call to stop having sex wasn't Alyssa's only attempt at raising awareness and activism around this subject, which is where my nuance for her comes in. Alyssa opposed Georgia's heartbeat ban bill before it went into effect, and she has urged TV and movie productions not to continue operating in Georgia now that this abortion ban is legal, which seems to have, at least at first, been effective with a couple of productions. If you've watched a lot of American TV and movies, a lot of them you'll see like the logo for the state of Georgia, because Georgia does like kickbacks for productions and stuff. So I do want to point out it is genuinely meaningful for an actress to say, hey, we should boycott this state and not go there if this is how they're treating the people who live there. I think that is meaningful. But, as was pointed out very swiftly at the time of the sex strike proposal, that one was maybe not quite as meaningful. The sex strike idea is just, really not quite it. First of all, it very much echoes the Republican talking point of, if you don't want a baby, just don't have sex. Not at all what she's trying to say, obviously, but you can see, I'm sure, how somebody could warp that into a tacit agreement that people who can get pregnant can in fact just opt out of ever needing to have an abortion. This, on the part of the Republicans, of course, ignores the fact that many abortion patients did not consent to the sex that got them pregnant. And Georgia specifically has a theoretical exemption for rape under 20 weeks, but the victim needs to have filed a police report in order to get an abortion, something many victims are not prepared to do within that time frame or ever. And this is bleak, this is a horrible truth, but it is part of why I am so intense about abortion, right? Nobody who can get pregnant actually gets to live with no fear of being impregnated and then needing an abortion. None of us. Not if we are lesbians, not if we are on sex strikes for the rest of our lives. Sexual assault does not respect a sex strike. And if I had to guess, if I had money to bet, I would bet my money on the fact that Alyssa Milano knows this. In the same way that I bet that most people touting the 4B movement also know it. But this is why it's very important to be extremely precise about what kind of shit you will allow from people who want to restrict abortion, and not to give them something in your own words that they can say back but twisted into evangelical pro-forced birtherism. And if you're up on historical feminist movements even a little bit, you may be wondering by now, as you're tracing this thread that we're pulling, looking at this 4B movement and also this sex strike, and me saying separatism, oh wait, isn't this just political lesbianism? Which it kind of is, and it also kind of isn't. Because a similarity between both of these calls to action that I've spoken about so far, this 4B movement and also the sex strike Alyssa Milano proposed, is that neither of them actually directly invoke lesbianism. So political lesbianism is a primarily second wave and radical feminist concept, and it is the idea that my sexuality, lesbianism, did I ever mention on this channel that I'm a lesbian? I'm not sure if that's come up. But anyway, it's the position that, and remember what I was just saying about how Alyssa Milano accidentally feeds into Republican talking points, the position that lesbian sexuality is not only an opt-in reality, but also that making that choice, that decision to just sort of go lesbian mode is a moral and political imperative of sorts, which is separatism. It's just separatism. All of this is separatism. It's separatism all the way down. Separatism does not always invoke lesbianism as part of the decision to be separatist. There are very much heterosexual separatists, and there were certainly a lot of heterosexual political lesbians back when that was the movement. And I also think a lot of political lesbians were just bisexual women who were with women for a long time and then moved on and their next partner was a man, and whether because of internalized biphobia or lack of language or self-acceptance, they just were like, oh, I was being a political lesbian and now I'm not. Or also, don't think we should discount that that's how lesbians who are feeling heartbroken and a little bit bitter about their bisexual girlfriend leaving them might have characterized their girlfriends after the fact, right? There is also, we're gonna get to biphobia in general, but it's there for me in the way that a lot of people still talk about political lesbianism, which if we're talking about something that would result in a lot of long-term relationships and then maybe breakups as a political movement kind of fell apart, I do understand there are actual feelings of hurt and hard feelings, but they're hurt and hard feelings that should exist between the individual people who were in a relationship and broke up, and not things that should carry on into rivalry between lesbians and people who they assume are being political lesbians or bisexuals or whatever. Just believe people when they tell you what their sexuality is. It's weird to assume everybody's lying about that if you're not lying about it. A feminist named Sheila Jeffries wrote a piece about this with the Leeds Revolutionary Feminist group. And I found a version of it scanned online because I wanted to make sure that I was actually engaging with the thought behind political lesbianism and not just what I think it is from how people talk about it on either side. So the political lesbianism piece that I read is the one that's referenced on the Wikipedia page for political lesbianism. It's called Love Your Enemy? The debate between heterosexual feminism and political lesbianism. And I'm not going to read you the whole 33 pages, but I would like to read you some of the introduction, just so you can get a sense of exactly how long this kind of prescriptive argument has been uselessly attempted, and why Trash and I both were like, oh wait, this is just political lesbianism, as soon as we saw these 4B posts start to circulate. We know that the question of whether all feminists should be lesbians is not new. We have had to work out our ideas on the subject because often when we talk about our politics and what it means to say men are the enemy with other women, we are asked whether we are saying that all feminists should be lesbians. We realize that the topic is explosive. It is something we are supposed to talk about at home and in close and trusted groups of friends and not make political statements about in the movement, lest our heterosexual sisters accuse us of women hating. Is it true that we must conceal our strong political beliefs on the subject when talking with other feminists? We would like to raise the whole issue for discussion in a workshop, not just whether all feminists should be lesbians, but precisely why we think they should be, and whether and how we may begin to talk about it more openly. We do think that all feminists can and should be political lesbians. Our definition of a political lesbian is a woman-identified woman who does not fuck men. It does not mean compulsory sexual activity with women. This paper is divided into two parts. The first cover the reasons why we think serious feminists have no choice but to abandon heterosexuality. The second is arranged in the forms of questions raised and comments made to us about the subject of political lesbianism and the way we think they should be answered. So the way this piece is published in the version that I read, it had several rebuttals published along with it, written in by readers of a publication who had carried the original essay without an argument and drew some pretty well-deserved ire from their readers for it. One response I particularly enjoyed ended with, "Yours in no sisterhood whatsoever," which I thought was a banger line. And I think "yours in no sisterhood whatsoever" really does feel like a fair way to feel after reading this piece. I really wanted to go in with an open mind, even though that whole political lesbian means a woman-identified woman who does not fuck men thing does not mean compulsory sexual activity, plus whining at how people are calling them rude for being rude already had me looking at this with a real squint. I still tried to go in with an open mind. Bell Hooks also actually explained already in Feminism is for Everybody what woman-identified woman means in these contexts. I want to read to you from this portion first. This is before "what is a woman" was like the catchy culture war question. So woman-identified woman doesn't exactly just mean like a woman who identifies as a woman. It's more like a woman who identifies with women rather than identifying with men. I'm just going to read from Hooks here. In the early stages of feminist movement, we used the phrase woman-identified woman or man-identified woman to distinguish between those activists who did not choose lesbianism, but who did choose to be woman-identified, meaning their ontological existence did not depend on male affirmation. Male-identified females were those who dropped feminist principles in a flash if they interfered with romantic heterosexual concerns. They were the females who also supported men more than women, who could always see things from the male perspective. And it is not at all hard to imagine that Love Your Enemy and other works like it is where a lot of people who were using the term man-identified woman or others like it as a jab were getting and then furthering those ideas. Love Your Enemy is bad. It's not a well-written or persuasive argument. It's instead just a paranoid and divisive essay where the writer, as is pointed out in the pages of responses laid out underneath it, offers no vulnerability of their own while also wanting to strangle out the individuality, sexuality, and sexual liberation of the women who read it. This is a prescriptive and self-righteous text. It's the sort of thing that feels written not to convince anyone to agree with you, but to convince the people who already agree with you that the rest of the world is incredibly cruel for telling you to stop being so rude. And current-day radical feminists use this rhetoric as well. especially the trans exclusionary ones. This is a pipeline they very much use. This is something that's baked very much into the concept of peak trans, a thing discussed on gender critical forums, where a transphobe will present themselves as if they had been totally willing to go along with trans rights as a movement, and then now, usually after they have met some caricature of a trans person or a trans rights activist, then now they have hit peak trans, and that means that they no longer are able to maintain being polite, and that they think that everybody else who does want to maintain being polite and who wants to be fucking nice to trans people simply needs to catch up to them, and that them being loudly cruel or going to these spaces to be cruel where other people can go find it out is giving others a chance to catch up and be peaked. What this actually does, though, in practice, is partition the so-called rude femmes away from the trans inclusionary feminists, because the rude femmes are mean, and they're wrong, and we do not want to be associated with them. And then now that we don't want to be associated with them, they feed into each other's hatred, now fueled by the fact that they've isolated themselves away from communities that could be supportive with other feminists. And they've isolated themselves by declaring those other groups the enemy. Like, I want to be clear that this isn't a situation where I'm sitting here saying we should feel sad and be inclusive to radfems. I'm saying this is just what happens. You get isolated when you play into an us versus them game. If you engage in us versus them thinking, the them always gets wider and wider, because now if it's an us and trans person is a them, it's not just the trans people who are the them anymore. It's anyone who supports trans people, anyone who uses the correct pronouns for somebody who the people who are saying they're an us think should be misgendered. Like, this isn't just a pipeline to the right, it is a water slide. It is extremely, extremely effective with people who are very transphobic. And other groups on the right also use these tactics. Like, little children are taught in Sunday school in evangelical and fundamentalist Christian churches to do outreach, and they are told that it is for the purpose of winning souls for Christ, making sure people don't go to hell. Like, they do have good intentions, they're just being indoctrinated. But part of that indoctrination isn't that they're learning particularly persuasive arguments or that there's actually some tally of how many people they've converted to Christianity. It's that eventually somebody pushes back against their well-intentioned God-bothering, and then that child goes home to their parents or to the church, and they say how negative that experience was. And then they are immediately affirmed by the church and their parents that the church is the correct, kind, and loving place, and that the outside world is scary and dangerous and cruel, and that's why they weren't open to being proselytized to. Another reason why you should also not be mean to Jehovah's Witness door knockers, like, you can tell them no and that you don't have time and that you already have another religion or whatever, but you should very much know when you interact with people in a cult that the cult that they are in is, like, somewhat concerned with finding and recruiting new members and very, very concerned with keeping the members that they do have feeling like the cult is their safe, protective bubble where only they know the truth that the rest of the world is blinded to. And I can't see anything but those same tactics in the way that Love Your Enemy is written. I can't see anything but somebody who's sitting there saying, well, this isn't going to win anyone over to our side, but it will make the people who agree with us feel very validated to see this in print, which is something that somebody's editor should have noticed and pushed for a revision, I think. But this paper existed to be the validation of these political lesbianism ideas, to provide both the experience of seeing pushback and of having that pushback demolished to women who were too afraid to even voice this out loud and get this kind of pushback in real life for themselves. It functions essentially the same way that having kids roleplay evangelizing to strangers in Sunday school or youth group does, the same way that posts about hitting peak trans do. But it's structured as if it's not that. It's structured as if they do actually want to win people to their side, as if any straight woman would read this, see heterosexual relationships described as the basic unit of the political structure of male supremacy, and just pack their bags. And that's not because they actually believe that that's going to happen. It's because they want the people who already agree with them to see these heterosexual women who won't do that as unreasonable, as refusing to see their own endorsement of patriarchy, which seems so obvious to the writer. I don't want to read through all of the questions and answers, but I do want to read the very first one, because the same way that that introduction sets the tone, I think so too does this. Questions and comments. Question: But it sounds like you are saying that heterosexual women are the enemy. Answer: no, men are the enemy. Heterosexual women are collaborators with the enemy. All the good work that our heterosexual feminist sisters do for women is undermined by the counter-revolutionary activity they engage in with men. Being a heterosexual feminist is like being in the resistance in Nazi-occupied Europe, where in the daytime you blow up a bridge, in the evening you rush to repair it. Take women's aid, for example. Women who live with men cannot tell battered women that survival without men is possible, since they are not doing it themselves. Every woman who lives with or fucks a man helps to maintain the oppression of her sisters and hinders our struggle. So, obviously, there are a lot of things I find deeply and completely wrong with this. So, like, take women's aid, for example. Women who live with men cannot tell battered women that survival without men is possible since they are not doing it themselves. Are you fucking kidding me? Like, this is so ridiculous. A married woman with a husband who is spending her time helping battered women is doing more for the liberation of women than 10,000 of these self-righteous leaflets ever would. And I'm saying that as somebody who thinks that feminist theory is very important even when it is flawed. So let me actually tell you about some feminist theory that I don't find deeply upsetting and flawed. As I mentioned earlier, bell hooks. I'm going to tell you more about the book that this is from in a bit, but first I want to talk about how bell hooks herself described this political lesbianism movement. When contemporary feminist movement was at its peak, the institution of marriage was harshly critiqued. The entrance of many heterosexual women into the movement had been sparked by male domination in intimate relationships, particularly long-time marriages where gender iniquity was the norm. From the onset, the movement challenged the double standard in relationships to sexuality, which condemned females who were not virgins or faithful lovers and spouses, while allowing men the space to do whatever they desired sexually and have their behavior condoned. The sexual liberation movement strengthened feminist critique of marriage, especially the demand for safe, affordable birth control. Early on, feminist activists focused so much attention on private bonds and domestic relationships because it was in those circumstances that women of all classes and races felt the brunt of male domination, whether from patriarchal parents or spouses. A woman might assertively challenge a sexist male boss or strangers' attempt to dominate her, then go home and submit to her partner. Contemporary feminists, both those heterosexual women who had come from long-time marriages and lesbian allies in struggle, critiqued marriage as yet another form of sexual slavery. They highlighted the way traditionally sexist bonds led to marriages where elements of intimacy, care, and respect were sacrificed so that men could be on top, could be patriarchs ruling the roost. Early on, many feminist women were pessimistic about men changing. Some heterosexual women decided that they would choose celibacy or lesbianism over seeking after unequal relationships with sexist men. Others saw sexual monogamy with men as reinforcing the idea that the female body was property belonging to the individual male she was bonded with. We chose non-monogamous relationships and often refused to marry. We believed living with a male partner without state-sanctioned marriage within patriarchal society helped men maintain a healthy respect for female autonomy. Feminists advocated demanding an end to sexual slavery and called attention to the prevalence of marital rape, while at the same time championing the rights of women to express sexual desire, initiate sexual interaction, and be sexually fulfilled. So, Feminism is for Everybody is fantastic. Bell Hooks wrote it in 2000, and it is a work that identifies not men or so-called male collaborators as being the root of patriarchy or what feminism seeks to defeat. It's a book that places the blame squarely where it belongs instead, onto sexism. And Bell Hooks is extremely correct about this. Men categorically are not the problem. Sexism is. Men who do not renounce sexism and their privileges based on it are. And because sexism and not men is the problem, women are also capable of enacting and perpetuating misogyny and enforcing patriarchal power structures. Hooks actually refers to her mother as the strongest enforcer of patriarchal thought in her childhood. But she also describes her mother as having eventually come around to feminist thinking, as being won over by seeing her daughter's side of the movement after she witnessed for herself the gains that feminism was able to make in the lives of the people who she knew. Which is both possible and important. Even women who have patriarchal and sexist thought deeply ingrained into them can and should be won for our cause if we don't entirely write them off. And for that matter, and by that same card, so can men who are interested in and invested in our rights. And then they get to go and do more of the winning over for us themselves once they have been equipped with the right information, which they can't get if we're not allowing them into the rooms where we're speaking. I mean, men really have been feminists for really, really long into the history of the movement existing, and people who tell you that they haven't been and that they can't be are just being divisive and not actually helping our cause. More from Feminism is for everybody here in regards to men being feminists. There were many heterosexual men who embraced feminist thinking precisely because they were unfulfilled sexually in relationships with partners who were not interested in sex because they had been taught virtuous women were not sexually active. These men were grateful to feminist movement for offering a liberatory sexual paradigm for female mates, because it ensured that they would have a more fulfilling sex life. By challenging the notion that a woman's virtue was determined by her sexual practice, feminist thinkers not only took away the stigma attached to not being a virgin, they placed female sexual well-being on an equal par with that of men. I think that's significant, and I also think it's significant that we lose the ability to deploy well-meaning and liberal men to go and further our messages if we write them off entirely and we exclude them from our organizing, from our empathy, from our solidarity. Something that Bell Hooks describes as being a problem with the current perception of feminism is that most opinions held of feminism are based on second or third-hand information. People are summarizing what they've been told by somebody else, usually a bad actor, that feminists believe, and they're basing their opinions based on what they heard from somebody after summarizing that, and not based on what feminists are actually saying. I think that's super astute, and I do get comments fairly frequently. I mean, not all the time. I think most people watching me already know that they're feminists, because I open all of my videos with calling myself a feminist and a lesbian. And because of that, I'll sometimes get comments from people who say like, oh, wow, girl, I typically don't think I agree with feminists, but you're on point. I really like your videos. And I make myself wait because if I don't think somebody's ready to hear it, I don't think this would be useful. But that's why I introduce myself as a feminist. I like for people to have to reckon with the fact that if they agreed with what I said and the perspective that I took to get there, that they might in fact agree with me on my feminist ideals. Some of them actually don't, even though they like my videos, I guess. I'll hear from people sometimes who are in favor of, like, conservative forced birth policies, despite my sign on the wall, and I comment block those people. But somebody who is positive intentioned and feminist curious is welcome both on my channel and in my feminism. Anyway, as obvious by that entire tangent, I have a lot of thoughts about separatism as a concept, and especially in regards to the way that it just absolutely destroys solidarity and community. And they're thoughts that I pulled a friend in to help me unpack. So this is my friend Trash Discourse, who you absolutely should be following if you enjoy the videos that I make. They make amazing, amazing, and very non-self-censorious content. I've definitely pointed people their way in other videos before as well, but this is the first collab, and I'm very excited about it. They also have a video about this exact same thing, and I am in theirs, so you could do a double feature tonight if you wanted to.
Hi, I'm Trash. I'm a non-binary bisexual who likes to talk about queer history. Which is good, because this ideology is not new. Political lesbianism and lesbian separatism rose alongside the second-wave feminist movement in the 1960s and 70s. It was popular among middle-class white women within the second-wave feminist movement, and it framed political lesbianism as the best possible lifestyle, the most moral choice. Many went so far as to say that those who dated men were betraying the feminist movement. Sentiments I see now in the 4B movement. But the big issue was, the civil rights movement was still happening at that time. Black people as a class were fighting just for their right to exist in public, their right not to be over-policed, their right to not be discriminated against, things that are still issues today. While white feminists were doing important work, they were holding these consciousness-raising sessions to teach women about their bodies, they were teaching them how to do menstrual extractions, which are something that can be used for abortion care. They were fighting against workplace discrimination for women, which obviously was a huge issue back then and still is today. They were doing all of this really important work. Meanwhile, Black women were in the streets, fighting for their community's right to exist, fighting against both police attacks and civilian terrorist attacks, on their communities. They were organizing food programs for children. They were getting themselves and their communities armed to do armed self-defense against these terrorists, and unarmed self-defense as well. They were fighting the struggle for Black liberation. They were doing this alongside Black men, their fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons, the young men in their lives who were at risk of being lynched every time they stepped out of their houses. They were fighting an existential struggle, often alongside movements like the Black Panther Party, which organized not only for Black liberation, but with women to further feminist causes, and with queer people during the gay liberation movement, which was ongoing at the time as well, because they understood, the Black Panther Party understood, what these feminist movements didn't, which is that the struggles of marginalized people are one struggle. But due to the combination of racism and the fact that these Black women were partnering with Black men in the struggle for Black liberation, the feminist movement saw this as a betrayal. They said, "Why are you partnering with men? You are betraying feminism by choosing men over us." They decided these Black women were not good feminists because they were choosing their oppressor, men, instead of these nice white women. Many of these women posited that these Black women come from backwards, savage cultures, and that's why they don't understand our incredible feminist theory. Of course, that theory didn't account for the fact that as white women, they were also Black women's oppressors, and had been for a long time. I recommend the books They Were Her Property and White Tears, Black Scars for further reading about that. White women take part in the oppression of Black people, both back then and today. Why would Black women partner with the women who called for the lynching of their sons, brothers, and cousins? Why would they choose these white women, their oppressors, over their own family members? Why would they do that? Being expected to make that kind of choice and called a traitor to feminism for not choosing these white women over their own family members must have felt like a slap in the face, like salt in the wound. Like the restraint of these Black women for not just splitting those women's faces open when they were met with that kind of thing. Like, I cannot imagine having that much restraint. I would have been waiting for them in the parking lot. But they didn't. They had a struggle to fight. They had an existential threat that they had to fight against, and that mattered more. So the feminist movement lost the support of racialized women, because, frankly, a lot of these early feminist organizers were explicitly racist. And the movement made demands of these marginalized women that they could not meet. And then it insulted and degraded them for not giving in to those unreasonable demands. And this is the problem with the modern 4B movement and political lesbianism movement, which I would actually call political celibacy, not political lesbianism. Because they're not really advocating for lesbianism, are they? They're advocating for celibacy, for abstinence. They're abstinence perverts. Whatever you call it, they want women to stop having sex with men. That's all well and good if you're a lesbian. If you're a lesbian, that's pretty much the default. You know, you're probably not having sex with men already. But for the rest of women, like for the bisexual women, they can probably just not have sex with men. Asexual women can definitely not have sex with men. But then you get to the heterosexual women. Heterosexual women, sure, they could just not have sex with men, but that would require a life of celibacy. Should they have to deny themselves sexual intimacy their entire lives for this ideology? Should an ideology require you to be celibate? The Catholic Church says yes. They require their priests and nuns to be celibate. They take vows of celibacy. But of course, the Catholic Church has actually flip-flopped on that a few times throughout the years. A lot of churches demand that gay people be celibate, or engage in heterosexuality that they don't necessarily want. They're like, it's fine if you're gay, as long as you're celibate, or you don't act on that gayness. The Mormons are kind of notorious for this, and do we really want to be like the Mormons? I hear this same sentiment echoed in this 4B political lesbianism movement. It's fine to be heterosexual as long as you don't act on it. You need to decenter men. And I agree, female friendships are super important. Yeah, women's friendships are really important. This is definitely something I've observed in my study of women. And I've done a lot of studying. Decentering men can mean a lot of things. Putting women and feminism first? Great. But that's not how it's being used. A lot of them are using it to mean political lesbianism, or political celibacy. It means just being celibate forever if you're a heterosexual. And it's my personal opinion that people shouldn't have to be celibate to be considered morally pure. Because sex is not impure. Sex is good. The anti-sex attitude in this movement is really interesting to me. They view sex, with a man specifically, as something that taints you, as something that makes you impure. Having sex reflects poorly on your moral character. Any man, any sex. We see this repeated by radical feminists online. This post suggests that having sex with a man leaves a man residue on you. Sorry, but is that not just purity culture? What is it about a penis that makes you tainted and impure forever? You can't be a feminist if you suck a man's dick, or fuck a man, or put your dick in a man's butt. We are recreating the ideology of our oppressors and slapping a feminist veneer on it. We're telling women that their sexuality is impure and makes them bad, that they aren't a good person if they have the wrong kind of sex, and I am not cool with that. Sorry, but if your feminism demands that I abandon my sexuality, that I chop off a part of myself to appease you, that is authoritarian belief, and it sucks. It pushes people out. It pushes heterosexual women out of feminism and tells them that feminism is not for them. And a lot of people will caveat and say they can still be feminists, just not for B, but that is not how it's functioning in real life. This movement is pushing women out. It's pushing out women who want to fuck men, like these married women. 50% of women are married, mostly to men. You're pushing those women out of your feminism. And also some of the most marginalized women, some of these most marginalized women who are in domestic violence situations, abusive relationships, where they can't leave, where they're trying to leave, trying to build up the ability to leave, but they can't because leaving is the most dangerous time. And sex workers, a category of people which includes some of the most marginalized women. After that, who's left? A handful of TERFs and lesbians who will undoubtedly just gatekeep and push each other out of the movement because no one is ever pure enough for this kind of ideology. This is bad feminism. It's bad praxis. It's not praxis at all. It's literally doing nothing. A lot of people confuse political praxis with just literally doing nothing. A lot of people make that mistake. Well, this is just literally doing nothing, but in a way that seems almost designed to destroy feminist organizing, to bring feminist momentum to a halt by stoking gatekeeping and infighting. It sucks. This ideology sucks, and it only serves the function of harming the feminist movement and pushing people out of it.
And just to show our work here a bit, I would like to read from Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks, where she completely describes exactly how this kind of political lesbianism movement turns women away from feminism. When feminist movement was hot, radical lesbian activists constantly demanded that straight women reconsider their bonds with men, raising the question of whether or not it was possible for women to ever have a liberated heterosexual experience within a patriarchal context. This interrogation was useful for the movement. It not only forced straight women to engage in ongoing critical vigilance about heterosexual practice, it highlighted lesbians in ways that positively exposed their strength while also revealing weaknesses. Individual women who moved from having relationships with men to choosing women because they were seduced by the popular slogan, "Feminism is the theory, lesbianism the practice," soon found that these relationships were as emotionally demanding and as fraught with difficulties as any other. The extent to which lesbian partnership was as good as or better than heterosexual bonds was usually determined not by both parties being of the same sex, but by the extent of their commitment to breaking with notions of romance and partnership informed by a culture of domination's sadomasochistic assumption that in every relationship there is a dominant and a submissive party. Sexual promiscuity among lesbians could no more be equated with sexual liberation than it could be in heterosexual practice. Irrespective of their sexual preference, women who suffered emotionally by equating the two were disillusioned by sex. And given the connection between male domination and sexual violence, it is not surprising that women who had been involved with men were often the most vocal about their sexual unhappiness. The consequence of this disillusionment with the dream of sexual freedom was that many individual feminist thinkers either came away from coping with these experiences and or the negative fallout a female friend or comrade faced, harboring repressed resentment about all sexual activity, especially sexual contact with men. Radical lesbians who had once been the lone voices calling women to account for, quote, sleeping with the enemy, end quote, were now joined by heterosexual women who were choosing same-sex bonds because they were utterly disillusioned with men. Suddenly, the discourse on sexuality, particularly all discussion of intercourse that emerged, made it seem that all coitus was sexual coercion, that any penetration of the female by the male was rape. For a time, these theories and the individual charismatic women who spread the news had a deep impact on the consciousness of young women who were struggling to establish new and different sexual identities. Many of these young women ended up choosing bisexual practice or choosing relationships with men where it was agreed that the female partner would determine the nature of all sexual encounter. However, masses of young females simply turned away from feminist thinking, and in this turning found their way back to outmoded sexist notions of sexual freedom and embraced them, at times, with a vengeance. I'm going to read more from Feminism is for Everybody in this video and also in a future video. I already made a community tab post about that. This is officially our first Nuance Corner book club book, so if you haven't already read it, don't worry, you don't need to. This isn't a full-on book club, but good starting point. And I also read more from Feminism is for Everybody in my cameo in the Trash Discourse video about this same subject. I might use some of that in this video. If you see me cut to a shot without my Christmas lights up, it's because I got a little carried away when I was filming for Trash's video, and I do not think that whole thing is going to end up in the final cut. This is a little bit of a long walk to take to get to addressing both what we just read from Feminism is for Everybody a moment ago, as well as many of the points that Trash touched on during their segment. But you clicked on a really long video about the historical context behind political lesbianism and how it informs the 4B movement, so I'm assuming you're just kind of down for the ride. Something else I find really frustrating about this is that I would really love to be evangelical about lesbianism. I mean, I already am. I'm always telling women I know who are bisexual who express to me that they think dating women is harder than dating men, that I think they should just try filtering their Tinder matches to just women and going on a few dates in order to test that. And I'm also always saying that I think that it's perfectly acceptable for a bisexual woman with no, actionable interest in dating or pursuing men to just describe herself with my identity label if that's what she feels like she wants to do. I think both that nobody should, pressure you into choosing to be gay out of a sense of obligation, but also that if you're at least somewhat same-gender attracted, it is worth being aware of the fact that you live in a society that reinforces to straight women and bisexual women and even to lesbian women that sex with men is a default and that they should potentially be open to that. And if you feel like your openness to that is actually a result of programming and not a result of genuine desire, you should absolutely explore and see if you can figure out what genuine desire and excitement feels like in romantic and sexual contexts for you. It might be completely different with women. It also might not. And for so many women, I think choosing to date other women and only date other women could be a fantastic, affirming, and life-changing choice, which is why it's one that I would love to be able to be vocal about. But I can't in the context of this 4B thing and political lesbian terminology. I just can't. Because this suggestion to be with women isn't even really a part of either of those things. At least in Love Your Enemy, they did present lesbianism as an option, but none of the graphics or posts I've seen about 4B are actually focusing on what else to do with your life once you have dedicated yourself to not doing those 4 specific things with men, right? They're not focusing on how you could have a relationship with a woman or ways that you could build community with other women around you, even in non-sexual or non-romantic contexts. They're not saying how compulsory heterosexuality sometimes makes bisexual women hesitant to act on their desires towards other women for fear of being rejected or seen as predatory. They're just saying men suck, and here's what we can do to punish them. And I just don't feel like that has literally anything to do with my experience of lesbianism. I am not a lesbian to punish men. I am not a lesbian because I hate men. I'm a lesbian because I love women. And I love women in a way that is inextricably tied to my own experience of my gender, which is not something that I have ever felt is personally possible or particularly desirable with someone who is not also a woman or some flavor or shade of non-binary lesbian. My feminism is political. My feminism is my politics, but my lesbianism, while it informs my feminism, is not a political act. It is a neutral one. And by that same measure, so is bisexuality, so is asexuality, and so is heterosexuality. Each and every single one as neutral as my own as a political statement. And I wanted to talk about this because not only does it tie into another thing I noticed as I was reading Love Your Enemy this weekend, both in the way the male-partnered women were portrayed in the question and answer section and in the original piece, was that it feels extremely similar to discourse that is already constantly being rehashed in the gay community. While straight feminists may have been able to spend a few years not worrying about the morals or ethics of a woman being partnered to a man, some of us are in the gay community, and we have to listen to people attempt to come to terms with this every few months. It is a guaranteed discourse topic every June, obviously. Bisexual women's straight boyfriends at Pride. Are they invited? Is that allowed? Obviously, none of them are bi for bi. That would be impossible. That does not exist. We have to flatten bi women down into the most one-dimensional version as possible so that we can remain as angry as we can about the idea of them corrupting the sanctity of this big convention where a bunch of corporations are putting up tables and trying to give you gay shit that is like cheap and going to break, and it's like Lockheed Martin branded. I don't give a shit if boyfriends go to corporate pride. I don't think any of us going to corporate pride is even a like protest action anymore. It's just like a street festival. And even if the boyfriend is straight and not bisexual, which they usually, a lot of them are, all of my bisexual friends are bi for bi, really. But even if he is completely 100% heterosexual, if you are able to go to Pride and bring him with you, I'm going to assume that he is at least an ally, which is good. And yeah, some bisexual women do in fact have homophobic boyfriends, but a great deal of them do not. So even though I think probably most bisexual women do not have these gross, weird homophobic boyfriends who are like unsafe and need to be kept away from the community, despite that fact, I am constantly being asked to rend my clothes and clutch my pearls at the possibility that I might see a straight man at a Chapel Roan concert or during a music festival Boy Genius is playing at or something. This is long, tired, and recycled discourse, and I see echoes of Love Your Enemy in a lot of these posts that Trash sent to me as we worked on these videos. It's 2024, and we are calling women with male partners bird brains in barbified shackles without realizing that we might in fact be the weird, gross sexists? And I will be called a traitor to the cause for this, make no mistake. The same points are being made against the lesbians who speak up now, against how weird, dehumanizing, and anti-feminist the language is today, as were in the Love Your Enemy pamphlet I read, where it said that the lesbians who are saying that kind of thing, who are defending women who are partnering with men, are not in fact true political lesbians, even if they do have sex, unlike some of the vol-cel political lesbians who were not gay. The actual lesbians, if they have solidarity with gay men, are in fact not true political lesbians. Not true believers and feminists, not truly women aligned enough. They're traitors. They're addicted to being treated as substitute inferior males by gay men, so therefore they have thrown their lot in for male domination by encouraging the continued subjugation of women into these heterosexual marriages, or whatever the fuck they're saying. But maybe the easier answer is that lesbian feminists like me speak up against how weird, dehumanizing, and anti-feminist this language is because we just do not, in fact, think that women who live with men have bird brains or live in barbified shackles or whatever. We speak up against how weird and misogynistic this is because we also try to speak up against biphobia and transphobia for the same reasons. Because misogyny against literally any woman hurts our cause as a whole. As a feminist lesbian, I have been asked to exclude trans women from my lesbianism and my feminism, and I said no. I have been asked to exclude bisexual women with boyfriends from my gay community, and I said no to that too. And now, I'm being asked to exclude straight women with husbands from my feminism, and I'm saying no. But what if I did say yes? who would I even still be standing with or for if I did say yes every time I was offered one of these exclusions? And what would the point of my standing even be if I only cared about women who have the exact same experiences in the world as I do? If I cared only about women and not about children, many of whom do in fact grow up to be men? And also, as a disabled lesbian, how long until I'm another one of those exclusions being offered up to the rest of the group? I am not interested in a lesbian supremacist feminism. That has never been part of my politics, and it wasn't even actually the politics of leading political lesbian thought leaders if they were just co-opting a label that didn't have anything to do with their own internal experience and trying to force it to describe themselves even though it didn't. This is a politics of repression of those other women, heterosexual women who weren't ready to give it all up and pack their bags in the name of separatist feminism, but also of their own repression. And I do think that it's deeply sad to hear that for some people there is no context in which they can imagine participating in sex without it being humiliating or without participating in their own subjugation. There are so many ways to participate in sex on an equal and consensual and excited, enthusiastic playing field, and as long as that's the way it's happening, I truly cannot fathom having the kind of reservation about it that drove this whole political lesbianism movement. I may feel personally about many forms of sex heterosexual women enjoy, the way the classic, I don't personally want an abortion, but I want somebody who needs one to be able to get it, pro-choice feminist is, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that women should have boyfriends. Like, I genuinely think that that would be a wild and incoherent take for me to have. There is no moral internal consistency where it's fine for me as a lesbian to still have sex and romantic partners, but then not okay if a woman wants to do exactly that with a man. I love people who are married to and partnered with men deeply, and I don't think that they are any less feminist, any less successful at decentering men than I am. I think they simply have a different sexuality than I do. And I think that part of feminism has always been being in coalition with women who have different experiences of the world and different sexualities than I do. I just see a real petulance in Love Your Enemy that I think gets carried through into trying to cast women who partner with men as the enemy in 2024 as well. This idea that just because a woman theoretically could abandon something she has that is a privilege, not doing so, even at the expense of her own happiness, satisfaction, or comfort, is a betrayal to the feminist movement as a whole, to feminist solidarity, to resisting the patriarchy. And while there are very much absolutely some privileges that a woman who gets to walk into a space with her husband or boyfriend and be read as straight experiences that I do not, there are also privileges that I experience as a white woman, a woman whose internal gender lines up close enough with my assigned gender that I don't get read as playing around with that ever, now that I stopped buzzing anything with the sides of my hair off. I have lots of privileges that other women do not get, regardless of what their sexuality is and if they share a sexuality with me. And that's not even to mention that some of the things that the author of Love Your Enemy lists as heterosexual privileges is actually laughable. Heterosexual privileges are male approval, more safety from physical attack, greater ease in dealing with the authorities, getting repairs done, safety from a besieging obscene phone caller, being able to refer to a man in the bus queue, or at work, which brings smiles of approval from women and men, let alone the financial advantages of being attached to a member of the male ruling class who has greater earning power. Because we choose to live without these privileges, we resent being used by heterosexual feminists as fueling stations when they are worn down by their struggles with men. Women's liberation groups and women's households should be a refuge for support for heterosexual sisters in resolving their contradictions by getting out, but should not be used to prop up heterosexual relationships and thereby shore up the structure of male supremacy. Some of these could be true, but none of them are the fault of the women who are less likely to be hate crimed by the police for being gay, even if they are. And some of them just feel patently untrue. Safety from a besieging obscene phone caller? I'm confused by. Everybody would have the same amount of ability to hang up and the same amount for people to call them back incessantly. And more safety from physical attack feels delusional in a completely different way. I hear from women who present in, like, I guess more typically feminine ways. Like, I'm pretty femme, I guess, but I'm definitely femme in a lesbian way. It's different. But I hear from some women that they get catcalled a lot more often than I experience it. And I do sometimes experience it, but, like, It's the same as the thing with the cop. If I'm getting hate crimed, it's probably for being a dyke, not because I'm any more at risk of sexual harassment than a straight woman is. And while gay women and straight women face different risks for sexual assault and are both at risk, and lesbian and bisexual women are at risk specifically for what is disgustingly referred to as corrective rape, but to claim that women who live with men are at a lower risk of attack is legitimately brainwormed behavior. If we're insulting people's brains now, let's start there, not with women who did nothing wrong other than date a man. Like, let's have some priorities. This demand that everyone give up whatever advantages that they do have, while ignoring that it was primarily advantaged white women who had the means to support themselves and better paying jobs upon entering the workforce, who were even able to go through with the whole let's cut off all men forever way of thinking for a few years. If you have enough advantages to actually support yourself as a single woman in like the 60s to 80s, you are actually most likely incredibly privileged over many of the women who you are speaking down to and calling collaborators with the enemy. Certainly not all political lesbians were wealthy white women, but I imagine it was much easier to be one if you were, right? Again, you should read Feminism is for Everybody. Bell Hooks very much sets the stage for what I mean about this. If other women who are not able to have the same privileges that I have as a white woman, are able and willing to be in solidarity with me despite those differences, I would be ridiculous and hypocritical to refuse to do the same for people who want to be in solidarity with me despite their differences. If you are doing the work, if you are spreading feminist thought, caring about equality and justice and about reproductive rights and the material well-being of women and children, you are on the same team as me. We are sharing our politics. But if you're spreading something divisive, if you're giving me a list of people who want and need and work towards the same things that I want and need and work towards, they're not acting against us getting those things, but you're telling me that I need to distrust them and dislike them, I'm not gonna listen to you. And that's not to say that there are no feminists that I can distrust, because Bell Hooks makes a very clear point that just calling yourself a feminist and being conservative, be that anti-choice or anti-sex, is no feminism at all. It's just diluting down a movement that could and should be powerful and using it only as a piece of your own branding to try to insulate yourself from complaints and criticism. I mean, I will still continue to criticize feminists. That's something I do on my channel sometimes, but like, it's not a level where I'm criticizing somebody before they even get in and make mistakes, right? Feminism can and should be criticized, but it should be criticized when it fails, when it's exclusionary, when it's cruel, when it is self-serving at the expense of others that it should help. Feminism should not be criticized, though, for just the presence of men, and especially not just for the presence of the women who love them. And the more space that we give to people who do want to criticize feminism based on whether or not its biggest proponents still fuck men, the intentionally smaller that we make our movement. And it is conservatives, make no mistake, who would like for feminism to be small and unchallenging. And for as long as feminism resists the help and the inclusion of people who are part of the dominant culture, which is straight people and straight men, no matter how much we may not like that, feminism will remain smaller than it needs to be and less challenging than it could be. I don't fuck with conservatives, so I'm not going to agree with the TERFs that feminism should be small to make the conservatives happy. I fuck with other feminists, and the kind of feminists who fuck with conservatives are not the kind of feminists I ever want to bother listening to. Another reason that I really hate all of this is that assuming that I took the radical feminists up on what they were offering me, and also assuming that I actually was included in what they are offering for their vision of the future, even though I would like to have sex with women in that vision of the future, and they probably will eventually turn around and say that I too, just like trans women, should be kept out of changing rooms and bathrooms and women's sports, right? But assuming that I ignore the fact that that feels like such an inevitability to me, and I pass up all the solidarity that I could feel with women who want the same things that I want, who need the same things that I need, who believe the same things that I do in terms of basic fucking human and reproductive rights. We have all of that in common, and yet I decide that I would like to buy into this hierarchy. And I say that it is, in fact, anything other than completely and totally morally neutral to date and marry men. If I'm saying that, and I'm believing that that is a bad and regressive way of doing things, and that it is not how the ideal feminist behaves, or even if I just talk about it in a way that implies that, who do you think that leaves being friendly and encouraging to women who would like to date men? If those women are not welcome in feminist spaces, who is being friendly to them? Because personally, I am very well aware that there are blocks and blocks of people lined up with open arms to be very, very welcoming and kind to these young women who are being excluded from the empathy and solidarity of their feminist peers based on the kind of relationship they would like to have. There are a lot of very sexist and regressive people who are very, very excited to tell young women that anybody who is criticizing their relationships with men is simply like a bitter, jealous, blue-haired liberal that they can just ignore. But to me, even if a woman has like a husband and a homestead and a bunch of children and sourdough starters, but she still cares about abortion access, she's on my side of the fight. Like I said, we would share politics. And even if she isn't particularly vocal about abortion yet, she still could be convinced and reasoned with. But I would never be able to reason with her if I just convinced myself that by right of partnering with a man, she has given an endorsement to patriarchy. I just don't think that's what partnering with a man means. I think it just means that your partner is a guy. I've got one more piece from Trash Discourse to share, and then I think we're in the back half of this video. I know this has been a long one, but I just have so many thoughts about this kind of stuff, and it's kind of what we're here to talk about anyway in the Nuance Corner, right?
So a lot of this ideology depends on men being fundamentally bad. Capital B, bad. That point is both fundamental to this ideology and rooted in gender fundamentalism and biological essentialism. It's just cloaked in feminist language. Men are evil, women are good. But when you get down to it, their belief is that women are naturally good, chaste, and pure, and men are naturally aggressive and sexual. This is literally Victorian old-school sexism that was used to justify this separate spheres ideology within the Victorian era, which sought to confine women to the home, confine them to the domestic sphere, disenfranchise them, disempower them, keep them out of public life, and unable to participate in the economy. They used this idea of them being pure and chaste to say, oh, they must be protected by being confined to the home and shut out of public life, because otherwise they'll be tainted by this public world full of maleness, which is inherently sexual and will taint their purity. This laid the groundwork for what we think of as the traditional 1950s housewife or tradwife that we think of today, a woman who is confined to her home, disempowered, and trapped in that relationship because she has no financial assets of her own. Trapped, ostensibly, for her own protection from the outside world because she's simply too pure for this world. That's the natural conclusion of this ideology, that women are simply too pure and need protecting, and that protection must be done against their will by confining them to the domestic sphere. In a tradwife situation. You see the same ideology within transphobia. It frames trans women as these hypersexual monsters, and trans men as these confused little girls who were tricked by this big bad ideology and they're mentally ill. And thus, trans men are medicalized and trans women are policed as a means to oppress them. Of course, in trans-inclusionary radical feminism, they just flip-flop that, and trans men are evil oppressors, while trans women are good, pure women. None of this is progressive. This is old-school sexist bullshit with feminist buzzwords slapped on top of it. Your identity is morally neutral. Being a man, morally neutral. Being a woman, morally neutral. Being a they, them, morally neutral. And while some people in certain demographics are more likely to be indoctrinated one way or another, we all choose every day how to behave, whether to be moral, ethical people or not. There is no essential goodness inside of all women and no essential badness inside of all men. Being born with a vagina does not imbue you with this inherent goodness and purity and sexual chastity. Go check out my channel if you want some proof of that. Neither having a vagina nor identifying as a woman makes you more morally pure than others. And being in an oppressed group does not make you more morally pure than others. Oppression does not purify you. This ideology leads us to treat trans people of all identities pretty badly because we have this gender essentialist or biological essentialist ideology of like, this identity is bad or this biology is bad. But the truth is, you aren't bad for your identity or your biology. Only your behaviors matter. And you should consider doing real feminist praxis instead of this bullshit. Because right now you're just doing nothing and then being mean about it online. And that's nothing. That's worse than nothing, actually. It's pushing people out of the feminist movement, just like the second wave feminists' refusal to be intersectional did. And we see this in tweets now. They're like, everything but feminism is a distraction. But intersectionality is not a distraction. Intersectionality is not a distraction. Liberation is not a zero-sum game. All marginalized people are together in the struggle for liberation. Or they should be anyway.
I obviously completely agree with Trash here, and I actually want to add another point too, in terms of how touting this 4B movement is worse than doing nothing because it's nothing and also mean and self-superior. And this one is like a less deep or important point than the one that your identity itself is morally neutral, and that solidarity and intersectionality is not a distraction from the struggle, but the struggle itself. This is more of kind of just a petty thing that I'm pointing out that I kept thinking of as I was working on this video. Which is, and you may disagree with me, but does this even really feel like it's decentering men to you? Because it doesn't to me. In theory, to decenter men should be to prioritize yourself and other women in your life and their struggles over, like, male approval and patriarchal standards. Becoming a woman-identified woman, to use the language that we already discussed in this video. Something you can do and still enjoy having recreational sex with men. Because so many feminists have been woman-aligned women who enjoyed having sex with men, as we've already discussed, right? But what I'm saying is that in practice, this 4B movement and things like it don't feel to me like they actually actively decenter men at all. Because again, it's mostly just sharing posts about how it is a moral or ethical imperative to no longer date or reproduce with men. And sharing posts denigrating women who aren't down with this particular extremist separatist cause and saying that they're just not as down with feminism in general as you are. I just don't think spending all your time focusing on how much you hate men categorically does anything to make them not the center of your worldview. And to be clear, it is so completely fine and understandable and acceptable if your experience of the world is one where you do not end up feeling comfortable being alone with, dating, or pursuing relationships with men. Like, that is okay. Even and especially if it does not bring with it a desire to have relationships with other women, okay? It is still absolutely okay to not desire to have relationships with men. But you're not really decentering them if all you're doing is spending your time tweeting and hand-wringing about how much you hate them. You are quite literally centering yourself around your hatred of men. You are using it to orient yourself, using it to set a list of rules which you will use to move throughout the world and also to hold up against women who didn't agree to those arbitrary rules and to see whether or not you think they're doing as well as you are at the whole feminism thing, and resenting them when they're not. If you don't want to date men, then don't date men. Please don't date men. But do it because it's either something that you want to do to not date men, or because dating men is something you do not want to do. Don't do it because you're conceiving of it as like a collective punishment against men. If it's for the sake of punishment, is that because you genuinely think that it will change the behavior of men as a class, or is it because you think that it signals your own morality as a feminist and your commitment to that? I think it does neither of those things. It proves nothing about your individual feminist merit, whether or not you date a man, and I know I don't have a big revolutionary imagination, but there is just no way that enough American women would get on board with this for it to be like a big groundswell political movement. This is always going to be a fringe thing at best. And I think it should remain that way because even if more women did participate in this, I don't think it would accomplish much culturally other than further stoke gender division. I just kind of think if you've tweeted, like, even just 2 or 3 times about how you are a 4B feminist and that makes you better than feminists who sleep with men, and how it is really cool and based and totally praxis that you hate men and do not go out with them and do not want to have their babies, that you should maybe be aware and think about the fact that there is a woman out there who has a husband and is in a relationship that is either, like, heterosexual or that just, she's having sex with a man and she's a bisexual woman. Either way, there's a woman out there with a husband who has sex with that husband that she really enjoys. And that sex that she has with her husband is not a political act. She is not using it as a political act. And in addition to having sex with her husband, she is also not spending a ton of her time publicly preening about how she hates men a lot more effectively and efficiently than the other feminists around her. She has spent less of her time centering herself around men than the rude femme who tweeted 18 times about how much she hates men and how great it is to be 4B. Like, I'm sorry, one of those women is spending a lot of time centering herself around men, and the other one, even if she has a husband, may not be. That's just how I think this all works. I've already said it, and I'll say it again, because, again, I've been saying it's okay to date men, and I want to make sure that I'm not coming across as if I'm saying that that's the only thing that I want women to do. I love it when women date each other or other non-binary people. I think that's really cool too. I also just probably don't hate your boyfriend. I almost certainly don't. Not if he shares politics with us. My concern about women dating men begins and ends at my concern with women dating anyone, at whether or not they are being treated well. I care if your boyfriend treats you well. I do. I care if he cares about your rights. I do think that you should break up with a man who just voted for a serial sexual abuser to be the president and an administration that is set on erasing reproductive rights. I'm in no way sitting here saying women don't need to break up with their Republican boyfriends. I think they should in pretty much every case, but some of them may not yet be ready to. And even though them not being ready to break up with their Republican boyfriend would mean that I maybe wouldn't want to come over to their house or hang out around their boyfriend, it still wouldn't mean that they were now excluded from my feminism. But I don't hate your boyfriend as long as he's not a Republican. And that's because I just don't categorically hate men. That's going to be something that some of the people who hate me on the internet will try to obsessively tell you is not true. They're very convinced that I do, but I really don't. I do not hate men. I've known some very kind men in my life. The handful of men that I love is small just because of how everything shakes out for me, but it does exist, and I do love those men. And my analytics tell me that I have something like 20%, I think, men over here, which is higher than it has been. It's definitely been in the low teens lately. But assuming that those men are actually watching and engaging with my videos, and I know that they are because I hear from some of them in my comment section sometimes, they are watching and intentionally seeking out the kind of videos that I, Ophi YouTube videos, feminist and lesbian, make on my channel. And if they agree with me enough to seek it out and engage with me, yeah, absolutely, there are feminist men who are invested in our struggle and who give a shit about the same things we give a shit about. I'm not saying it's not sometimes hard to distinguish or find these men. I'm not saying it's always easy or immediately apparent which men are safe or okay to be around. I'm not saying it's immediately apparent which men are nice and safe and can be invested in our struggle. And obviously, I think everybody should apply whatever kind of vibes-based, I think this person may not believe I deserve to have rights exclusions to their dating pool that they would like to. I think that's very good to do. That's not 4B, that's just good advice for dating somebody who will respect you. But it is so fine to date men and to enjoy that if that's the way that you're wired. And I just truly cannot imagine how isolating it would be to be asked to give that up if that were the case. And like Trash said, a lot of people are claiming that they're saying, well, I'm just 4B, and I'm not saying everybody has to be 4B, but I'm 4B, and 4B is also the best way to be a feminist if you're really serious about it. So even when people are claiming that they don't mean it in a prescriptive way, they're just sort of using this celebratory language for themselves for this thing that they're claiming isn't because they also want other women to do it. Do you want a whole video about Gold Star lesbian discourse? Because that would have been an extra 10 minutes in this one, but it could be its whole thing. Very similar here. And I do believe that some of the women pushing the 4B movement do really believe that there's just nothing wrong with using the existing language for something that exists. But like Trash said, it's just that so many people are using it in a way that is not that now when you use it, it looks like that's what you're signaling. And in terms of it being inherently exclusionary because of that, that's also why I wanted to start with the Alyssa Milano sex strike video, which I know was a while ago. It was longer for me than for you. One more reason that I didn't already get to that her sex strike proposal was criticized is because a sex strike like this, and using a term that implies like a designated uber feminist ideal, does this thing where it assumes that the people who are not participating in the strike are kind of then, by process of elimination, scabs, right? And that is very strange to me. It's just weird. Like, women who continue to have sex with men would not be scabs, they would not be crossing a picket line, but a sex strike does imply that they would be. And also, it's just very strange for me, as somebody who has been, like, accidentally participating in 4B and Alyssa Milano's sex strike for, I guess, my whole life, to suddenly be told that my actions, this thing that I have been doing in a way that is not praxis, and somehow also see that while my course of behavior is being described as the most feminist course of behavior to take, lesbians also are just not going to be part of this conversation, and they're not going to be brought up at all. And I did see some people using that Twitter bird, feel uncomfortable when we are not about me tweet to describe when lesbians were voicing their discomfort with this, and I a little bit could understand that, but if this movement were something that were more helpful to women than separatism is, I would agree that maybe let's not criticize a new feminist idea before it has a chance to get off the ground. But this is not a new feminist idea. We already know where this leads, so I'm going to criticize it. The fact that these talking points in feminism so often completely neglect to include gay or bisexual women just makes me feel uncomfortable in a way I can't help. Like I already said, this could be a helpful movement to encourage women who are interested in relationships with women to date each other. But it isn't being used as such because it isn't a vehicle to encourage that kind of participation, because this isn't about partaking in anything. Not in happy and fulfilling relationships with other women, not in successful and validating single lives, certainly not in politicized lesbian sex. These talking points focus instead on just deprivation. And they don't even think they're focusing on any deprivation of the self, just of deprivation of the men who will be punished by this collective withholding of sexual labor. And framing it only as labor, again, very much like the sex strike, implies that this is something that women participate in because men want it and not because they want it. And if you are a woman who participates in sex only because men want it, again, maybe consider if you would like to have a different relationship with sex. But if you do enjoy having sex with men, who the fuck am I to tell you that that makes you any less feminist? Who am I as a feminist or as a lesbian or as a woman or as a person? I get to live my life as a lesbian, and I get to have romantic and sexual relationships if I desire them without anybody telling me that that may or may not be feminist. Men are very much decentered in my life, but I get to say that and also still have sex, and women who are attracted only sexually to men may not? That's not fair. I just can't imagine, like, sitting on my little lesbian throne here and clinging to that superiority when it means that I'm just asking women to not do something that they would like to do. And, like, I don't know if or when this will happen for me, but I would really like to be gay married someday. I've always wanted that. I would love to have and be somebody's wife. I want that, and also am not currently pursuing dating because I'm focusing on my own self-actualization, right? But I am familiar with the concept of, like, oh, I would like to have a partner. And my imagination is not so busted that I can't imagine, even though for me it wouldn't finish this way, that somebody else would finish the I want a partner, and the way that mine is, and I would be their wife and they would be my wife, they would think, and I would be their wife and they would be my husband. I guess I probably could have put a he in there. And if it's not anti-feminist for a lesbian to want to get married, and it is not, then it is simply also not anti-feminist if a bisexual or straight woman marries a man. It just simply isn't. Marrying a man does not mean that you did not successfully decenter men in your life. It does not mean that you missed out on an opportunity that you now don't have to level up into a more feminist and self-actualized person. It doesn't mean that now you can't be anything but that guy's wife, and anybody telling you that it does mean that is being a weird sexist. Like, decentering men, being cognizant of and able to push against sexism and sexist thinking and standards that are baked in because of patriarchy. That's not a thing that you can, like, do better than other people and then be lauded for, because it's internal. And so maybe for something that internal, the message that's more helpful isn't that people without boyfriends have been more successful or better at decentering men than women with boyfriends are, but to voice that you can and should have a full life and be a full person as a human person and a woman without a boyfriend or also with one, if that's what you want. And that if he is good to you, you will have space to do that. You will still have hobbies and friendships and the ability to be your own full person. You don't need to work super hard on going out and finding one if you would rather be single. You certainly don't need to prioritize it over relationships with women if you don't want to. But there are, in fact, feminist men out there. There are kind, liberal, and leftist men who believe that you deserve rights and they vote in favor of that. Planned Parenthood reported a 12,000% increase in requests for vasectomy appointments following the election this month. Men who saw the results of the election and thought, oh fuck, here's something that I could do to make sure that if I'm sleeping with somebody, they're not going to be forced to carry a pregnancy to term. And who didn't even just think that, but who then called and scheduled appointments to actually go and do that. I've heard about this kind of thing before, too. I think that this is the highest, percentage increase I've ever seen reported. But it's not the first time that men have moved to do their part when they can in response to abortion access being erased. And any time that I hear that kind of story, it feels like whatever the opposite of a black pill is, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel hopeful. And I don't think that men like that, men who are good to their partner, men who are loving and kind and gentle and who are feminists, that they need to be excluded from the dating pool just for being men. In fact, if I'm giving serious dating advice to women here, it's never going to be, you can't have sex with men and still be a feminist. Not even just because I don't believe that, but because even if I did, if you tell somebody, this thing about you can't be true and also you be part of my in-group, most often the thing the person says is, okay, I won't be part of the in-group then. That happens with feminism. That happened when my mom told me that I couldn't give a shit about gay rights and also still be a Christian. Guess which of those I said, okay, I guess I'm not into that anymore. It wasn't the lesbian part. My advice, though, would be if you're going to date men, to date kind men. That I don't think that it's fair or reasonable or justified, really, for every single man to be included in our criticisms of the patriarchy and of sexism and of the society that we live in. And while distrust with or discomfort around stranger men isn't a switch that we can or even necessarily need to completely switch off, the assumption that absolutely no man can partner with us in our struggles, even if they are quite literally married to one of our sisters, is ridiculous and needs to be pushed back against, which I hope I have effectively done in this video. I want to talk more about men and feminism in a future video too. Definitely one of the ones where we discuss feminism is for everybody, most likely, but I also think we're probably going to need to book club The Will to Change as well after we finish Feminism is for Everybody, because I really want to read that one too. I've heard amazing things. So I will likely end up covering some of this same ground again in the future, but I think we have pretty well contextualized the American appropriation of the 4B movement against its history, and that you probably see by now what I'm saying about ways that it might not just be some flashy Mario mushroom to eat about your feminism. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you again so much to Trash Discourse for being part of this video, and thank you to all of you for watching all the way through to the end. Thank you so much to my Patreon subscribers who got a portion of this video early this week. If you're interested in a way to help support me financially, I have Patreon as well as Ko-fi, which is a huge help, and so is just liking the video, subscribing to my channel, all that stuff you're already doing. Thank you so much. I'll be back again soon. Love you. Bye.